This is Dave Monk, your Prarie Monk, WAFT, Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And
I'm Bill Saylor, sitting in for Dave Witzani on the board today. And if Dave allows, I'll say a thing or two as well.
Yes.
This is your weekly discussion of things environmental.
So
whether it's your local natural history landscape or cultural landscape.
Come around this side of the board and
sure,
have a few words
get
to
on
say.
the camera, make sure we're all heard. We're all heard, right?
Okay, Bill's brought in a feed plant.
It's
I have to
our,
ask questions. Is this a...
Let's date stamp.
What's that?
Let's date stamp. October 26, 2014.
You've got to come this way because you're in the...
No, I'm not. I can see the camera.
It's okay.
How about you?
Okay.
So I got a pea plant. It's the end of many things of the season, right? It's the end of October. And we cleared out our garden at Urbana Meadowbrook Park Community Gardens and rescued, we had like 3 radishes and the peas, which I just threw from some old packet in the drawer, and they grew, but they haven't fruited yet. So okay. I'm wondering if I can... now what? Now the winter's coming, they're not going to fruit in the pot, I don't think.
Peas are able to handle a fair bit of cold, but you usually don't let them get this high early in the season. They wait in the soil till spring.
Yeah, well, I don't want to wait till spring. I mean, so I'm not going to keep it till spring. The question is, can I get this to grow in the next, 4 weeks? And
yes, you can
make something I can eat.
Put them in your lounge room and have a little climber that they can climb up on.
I may do that,
so
but I think I need a bigger pot for the roots, right? Probably.
No, they're not like prairie plants. They don't have very deep roots, so you can probably keep them in the pot.
What's in your vase? What's in your vase over there?
These are the last of the season. A little bit like Bill, closing out for the season. These are zinnias from Tomatu's farm, and they last. And I like to see them around. There are some plants that go into the late season. So these are cultivars. That means they're plants that have been cultivated and bred to have interesting flowers. We do have native plants that are still blooming. Many of the asters are still blooming. New England aster is doing quite well at the present time. If we're collecting seed from the asters, we have to collect them later in the season. So you had a banana here.
Well, I had a banana. I have a banana.
So what was the story about the
banana? Not my ear. Well, I just brought it in to eat.
We
work on editing. But actually, I got it from something I never ever do was get up early on a Sunday and went on a 5K walk. It was a benefit walk.
Yes.
5K walk run. It was for College of Veterinary Medicine. I took some footage, so that's why I got to talk about it.
Okay.
But it started at College of Vet Med down on Lincoln Avenue and kind of went back behind where they're building a golf course. Did you know the golf course is going in by Round Barn? Have you seen that?
The Round Barn. Oh,
yeah.
Yes.
South
That's been
long in the plan, but it's starting to go in the ground, and I'm sure we will continue irrigating
I
when
think
it rains.
It has
and
associations
like
with business side of the university.
Sure.
So
golf.
It's
closer
in
home.
that
So they're starting to
South
build.
First
The
Street
university
area.
is starting to develop out. 4th Street is improved. So actually, this little route started at the college and went to 4th Street and then down to Windsor Road and kind of back along the gravel road, and you bring your pet. And it was a benefit for one of the professional fraternities or service organizations hosts it, and then it benefits, I think, the Wildlife Medical Clinic and a pet's place. My wife was telling me that is something of a shelter for pets in domestic violence situations.
WEFT has a cat program where they're saving cats. There's a program on Saturday afternoon.
Pause Radio.
Uh-huh. Yes.
Which is,
so
I have some affiliations there. So it was a beautiful morning. I mean, I almost played Windy and Warm off the Doc Watson CD to start because it's windy and warm today. Not too windy. It's going to be warm, and it's leaf collection season, so the leaves are coming down, especially when you get the burst of
Yes, a
burst of
little
warm. It's raining.
Pocket Prairie is
yellow
looking
leaves.
very nice. So what else do you have?
extreme.
There?
The last little bit of thing I guess I have. So I was on. I live on Google Maps often. Google
Yes,
Street View.
we're going to talk about a Google map.
Are you?
Sure.
Well, I'm going to talk about one too. So this is, I'll insert one in the video here in color. By the way, you can see the Prarie Monk on Urbana Public Access TV later in the week and eventually on YouTube.
Yes.
But I was looking around Peoria for some random reason. So Google Map in Peoria. And the first thing I noticed, actually, this isn't Google Map. This is, so I'll go back one. This is the Peoria County GIS itself. So it's the source, right?
Peoria does some interesting things.
They've had a good GIS for a long time, parcel details, and railroads on the map. Clearly visible on the base map, railroad lines, active railroad lines, and I know
That's
Dave
very
likes
helpful.
that. I like it too because it's a landmark I need to see a lot of time to figure out where I'm at on the map.
I went to Ann Arbor not too long ago, and the public map did not have the railroads on it.
Yeah. And so this line here are railroad segments. But they're segments. So you look at the map, and there's a chunk, and then there's another chunk, and it's almost in the middle of town. It's right behind one of the high schools.
It's the old Rock Island line.
And I'm like, I'm thinking, and then there's a line continuous through it, and I'm thinking, okay, and you can kind of see where it went. You know, you can connect the dots and where it used to
from
go
the lower
through
part
to
of
some factories or whatever. But this is a little short line off of it, right?
It went from the waterfront up to Peoria Heights, and it has
So
been
this is actually in Peoria Heights.
yeah,
so there's a little
discontinued.
Okay,
So
but here on the map are these two lines that don't connect, and they don't connect to the main line. I'm thinking, okay, why did they draw those on there, not connecting?
well, they're rail trails.
No, it's rail.
Yeah.
So you turn the picture on. Well, this is not the picture,
Oh.
but once you turn the aerial photo on and zoom in, it's rail. And what they drew on the map is where the rail still is, beginning to end. And then there's a few like house lots cut out of it, and there's no rail there. And then there's another chunk of rail behind the high school, and then it stops. But you zoom in, and there's just these, trees.
Even
and
the
under the
railroad-
trees, there's this rail still sitting there. It's like, well, that's very interesting.
Even the railroads are saving some of their rails.
This is kind of like way left over because, as it turns out, this main line that Dave just described, that this spur line comes off of, you could tell in both the aerial photos and once I got on Google Street Views, they did make a trail out of this just in the last 5 years or so.
Yes.
And you can see in the sequence of photos that are on there and the dates on the photos, you can practically see them, which pieces they phased
George
in first.
was very involved in that, a lawyer in East Peoria. And those spur lines serviced newspapers. Most of the newspaper paper came in with rails, and it was heavy rail. It wasn't light rail. So there was a question of whether the bicycles can handle intermittent use of the rail. If you're going to have a rail coming through your town, like in Chicago, where it was in the main street, can you have both? And the feeling was that you can't. So converted into vegetation and a walking, hiking, biking trail. And it joins up with another trail, the Rock Island Trail, from Peoria Heights through to Toulon, almost on the way to Bishop Hill, that sort of northwest part of the state. And it's probably, I would guess, 24 miles long, might be much longer than that, and goes through little towns called Wyoming and Toulon, and those towns have rejuvenated some because of the rail trail.
So some communities are quite active.
Yes, yes.
And very
and
recently
Peoria.
too. This seemed to. I mean, I don't know what kind of preparation, but it certainly got implemented in a short time
Yes.
between the rails coming out.
They've
and
been debating about
trail
it for a long
going
time.
in. Mhm.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to check the technical issue here and leave you to the rest of your agenda. This is WPFT Champaign 90.1 FM, You're listening
Thanks
to the Prarie Monk
for
program.
the updates that are appropriate. So interesting. George Burrier has been heading up the state rail trail movement for many years, and he was involved in that trail, but also the trail could have been extended from Morton, which is on the east side of Peoria, all the way to Maroa, which is near to Clinton. And that would mean that we would have a trail from Champaign to Clinton to Morton, and possibly a connection to the Hennepin Canal north and to the Quad Cities. Didn't happen. We missed that 56 miles because the adjacent owners wanted it back for agriculture and for lumber organizations and other things. But really it was sad to see huge trestles and bridges and rail beds go out. It's really hard to replace these things. That's why we have a Rail Banking Act. And the Rail Banking Act is specifically designed to allow or make use of people using trails, but the quid pro quo is that the Rail Banking Act has the right to take back the line for rail use in the future. It might be 50 or 100 years that you can have an interim trail use. And the 25 miles between Urbana and Danville, which is being instituted now as a rail trail, has that capacity. So if in the future the rails want to come from Bloomington, a fast line from Chicago to St. Louis, which connects at Bloomington, and if you want to connect Bloomington to Indianapolis, then this rail trail will be rail banked for that purpose, and it will revert at that time. But it might be a long time before that sort of organization is put into effect. They're looking seriously at fast tracks, and that includes a fast track from Urbana to Chicago, so business people especially can get to Chicago to do a day's work without having to do 2.5 hours of travel and perhaps sit on the siding for a while, because freight trains are much more valuable than people-moving trains. So this debate is going on, and it will go on for a long time, and it will involve a lot of technology that we don't have now. So there is time for the rail trail people to improve the corridor, to utilize it for both hiking and biking, and sometimes that's not long distance biking. It's from little town to little town. So from St. Joe to Ogden, from Ogden to Fithian, from Fithian on to Bucktown and other places. So it upgrades local communities. Some of those trails are 200 miles long. Some of them are just 2 miles long. But there are 1,500 of them now across the country, and they will allow railroad networking in the future. Sometimes that networking involves just short lines, like in Champaign. One of the plastic companies has a line that is a short line. It's just the other side of Prairie Gardens, which is a fairly recent line. And so agriculture is also involved, elevators. I'm going to talk a little bit later about Full's Elevator. Full's Elevator is about 5 or 6 miles east of Urbana, and it nearly preserved the railroad line there for short line agriculture. Now that grain goes to Sydney to meet a railroad there that comes through Sydney and goes south and north. And so they're still using railroad, but you have to transport that grain at 2, 3, 4, 5 miles to the gallon. So it's an expensive thing, whereas the rails are doing 450 miles a gallon, 1 ton of freight, 1 driver, and sometimes 80 mile an hour. Safety record that far exceeds anything on the road. So there's this debate is going on. It's long term and it won't happen quickly. And one of the problems is that unlike Europe, which is always used as an example, the populations are spread out. So there's a long distance between Chicago and St. Louis. That means a lot of rail maintenance with few cities or towns or villages in between, and that makes it more expensive to put in the infrastructure in the first place. So let me go back to my script. Yesterday I decided it was time to double check some of the things that are going on Route 45, Route 150, and to perhaps observe what was going on in the farming community because it's harvest time. I went south to 45. There have been, Ameren has been erecting steel stanchions there that are at least 100 feet high. They sit on a pedestal which is sometimes 60 feet low. That's because they're sitting on glacial till, which is fairly soft, and if you leave a rock on the top of a glacial till, it will gradually fall into the glacial till. If it's a thing like a tower, it can also move sideways and bend over, and elevators have the same problem. So that process has now been completed. The lines have been pulled in. The towers are much higher than the original wooden poles, and the culverts, which were used temporary culverts to allow heavy equipment to drill the pedestals in, or to drill holes for the pedestals and then pour concrete for the pedestals with huge amount of rebar in them. That activity is finished. The gravel used for the culverts has been retrieved for other jobs. And gravel is costly. Pallets were used around the areas, especially where there was prairie that was established and quality. Those pallets have been taken up, and the plants underneath there. You have to know that prairie plants have very deep roots, and if you have a few adventitious buds left on the top of the plant, then the roots will produce a new crop of prairie. We don't know about that yet, but we hope to forestall planting a roadside mix on top of a good prairie. So you replace an established, interesting prairie with a rinky-dink prairie, which is not as nearly as effective, not publicly so interesting. So our discussion is, what do we do with this? We had an agreement with Ameren that they use pedestals and not work the corridor. It's only a mile long from end to end, taking their equipment along the prairie that was not really subject to placement of pedestals. That agreement was basically obeyed by the heavy-duty equipment, which went out onto the road. They have down there, and still have down there, a gazillion of barrels, safety barrels, that you can move out for a certain time while equipment moves along the batter of the road. The batter of the road is that little portion that's probably about 5 feet of asphalt that's not used for traffic. It's the sort of place where you can get off the side of the road. Well, that allows equipment to move, and a lot of the equipment has rubber clee tracks these days, and that's very helpful. But the tidy up crews coming in, removing the gravel and tidying up the landscape, and not scraping it, but just tickling it to put it back to normal. They have been disobeying that agreement and running back and forth along the corridor. If this was a farm field with soybeans on it or corn, there would be a uproar if that were happening. But to look at our prairie, it's not either the people involved with the bobcats that are running this have not been told that it's a prairie, or it just is that there's a traditional way of planting a scarred area, and there may not even be a list of specifications. I've been trying to get specifications because there is a seed problem in the first place. The portion of the road which goes down to the ditch is usually planted to prairie grasses. If you're dealing with a prairie, there's a different mix for roadsides that don't involve a traditional prairie. But when you're dealing with a prairie, you put grasses on the roadside. They grow a little quicker and they grow a little taller, and they don't look quite so weedy as the broadleaves. Then in the ditch, you can grow wetland species like cordgrass and other sedges and wetland species that actually allow the water to absorb rather than to run off and cause erosion. The upside of the ditch and the conservation area beyond that is usually planted to broadleaves, and that's what we've done. In many cases, we didn't have to plant. This is original prairie that has been disturbed some by railroad activity, by road expansion from 2 lanes to 3 lanes to 5 lanes, and so it's not the most pristine site, but it is very, very publicly visible and lets people know what a prairie is. And there's so little prairie left that very few people know what a prairie looks like. They know about prairie concrete, they know about prairie laundry and prairie this and that, but not about the prairie itself. Very few people can name any of the prairie plants or recognize them. Looks just like weeds, and it has been a weeds for 6 generations when people were trying to get rid of the prairie in order to plant it. It's very, very fertile soil coming down from the Laurentian Shield in Canada with low glaciation, and so the prairie has been growing on that sort of good soil for 10,000 years, and that has taken the soil and matured it, and so now you not only have high quality glacial till, but you also have organic matter that has been there to give the soil structure and texture and organic matter, and wow, it's some of the best soil in the world. So it's no wonder that it's all been converted to corn and soybeans, or landscaping, or city dwellings. Some of the problems we encounter are that if you have a routine replanting, there's always the temptation to plant with switchgrass. Switchgrass is a prairie grass that grows very well. It's pretty aggressive, but it stays up over winter. So the like of birds, including pheasants, which are introduced, but they're part of the Prairie Act now, can lay their eggs in that grass, and it establishes fairly quickly. And always the Department of Transportation is looking for instant gratification. If you're on a regular roadside, that roadside mix will come back in perhaps 10 days if you use brome grass or stuff like that. If you're in a prairie, you look for a prairie grass that grows fairly quickly and establishes itself in a manner that would encourage the wildlife and creatures that are there. The wetland species are helpful. Then the conservation site, maybe in this case about 50 feet wide with broadleaves, is very natural for a prairie. If you infuse that with, we mix up the traditional roadside maintenance or replacement with the prairie, then you can have some confusion. Often roadsides are planted with a farm planting that is a sweet clover. It was a fodder that could be used, it could be mown 8 times a year, and it was very generous with it's a legume, so it's nutritious, and it also has rhizobacteria and can produce, it can modify nitrogen for uses. So it becomes somewhat of a natural fertilizer. So it's often planted, but it's extremely aggressive, and it can destroy a genuine prairie by raising it, and it's very costly to get rid of. There is also a vetch, which is often planted, but it's somewhat been banned because it doesn't effectively control erosion. It has one rootlet that is, and the plant's top is cosmetic. It spreads around the root, and so the erosion can go on underneath it. So we don't have such a problem with vetch. So we'd like to know what the seed mix is. We don't want to see any more switchgrass there. The Department of Transportation planted switchgrass years ago, and it's really tremendously aggressive and a bother, because when you have such a lot of leaf growth, you're going to have natural litter, and that is potential for fire. And that particular prairie is between Windsor Road and Curtis Road, and it's it's next to a shopping mall across the road, so it's very hard to do a control burn on this situation. The control burn is there because lightning has been striking the prairie for 10,000 years, and most of the prairie plants are attuned to being burned, and they decrease in viability if you don't burn intermittently, say every 3 or 5 years, and things like that. But often, when there's an accumulation of litter, if you let the litter accumulate for 10 years and somebody puts a cigarette butt into it, then it will catch fire and you'll have a prairie burn. It's uncontrollable. So we don't want any more switchgrass to give us that sort of problem. That means we need to look at the prairie mix that has been touted as what is going to be planted. We also want to know that it comes from Illinois. It's not seed that comes from Kansas or other places, because it's easier in those western areas. And west of the Mississippi, prairie gets to be used for fodder for cattle. So you can harvest prairie with a machinery, and that makes it cheaper. So often roadsides get prairie mixes that are low bid, low cost. If you're going to use Illinois seed, you're going to have to pick it by hand because there's almost no prairie left, and you can't go out and harvest it with a combined harvester and have a cheap seeding. So we want to know that seed that's coming will not come from out of state. Then we need to know how to plant it. We have three main different sites. On the north, we have the growth of trees, but where the soil was disturbed to create a new railroad bridge over Windsor Road. Windsor Road did not go through till about 10 years ago. And that bridge had to have abutments and had to have soil in there. So it's a very disturbed area, and it's a prime place for sumac to grow. And then once you see sumac, you start to see forest come later. A whole bunch of people over the years have tried to keep that forest in control, mainly because the prairie, if we have a prairie site, didn't really have a lot of trees on it. A few cottonwoods here and there, but it was basically a prairie. And so we've replanted that area to grasses and forbs, and they had to have a hard time competing with the forest. So that's a special situation, and it's also very hilly there. There's an embankment, and the sides of the embankment are steep. So that means that area probably has to be seeded with a hydroseeder. That's where you sort of spew out your seed in water and mulch, the mulch to keep the seed in place and to stop it from eroding, or stop the bank from eroding. So that is a different sort of treatment than in other places. Just near to that, and near to a big advertising billboard, there's an area which is fairly natural, and it has a lot of starry-eyed grass and other plants that are very indicative of prairie. So we changed now so that the body politic of the prairie is a fairly good prairie, and we looked for a planting that would wait to see whether the prairie is going to grow back after being under culverts and pallets for 2 months, and then we need to plant. Unfortunately, at this time of the year, the prairie is fairly dormant, so we're not going to see that grow quickly. But on 150, we see it happening because it was allowed to grow back a few months ago. But interestingly, the weeds, when you disturb a soil, the weeds come in. The weeds like good fertilizer and good soft, moist soil. And so help me, on 150, the locust trees and equisetum, which is a prairie plant that can be kind of weedy, they're coming through loud and clear. So we don't want to disturb our quality prairie very much and allow the weeds to grow. That means we want to make sure that nobody puts any fertilizer in or any sweet clover. That means we have to look at the species list, and then we have to look at the style of planting. Usual planting is to take a cultivator, a disc cultivator, and dig up the soil and plant seed. You also plant a cover crop of oats, wheat, and barley, or something like that, so that it will control erosion for a year or two. The wheat and barley and the like won't plant themselves. Come up a little bit in the second and third year, but basically they leave room for the prairie to grow. The prairie grows very slowly. They also, after the cultivation with a regular disc, they'll lay down hay and then use a scallop disc to make that hay sit into the soil and stick up as erosion control. So that, again, disturbs the soil. So we're watching. So we need to know, from a planting point of view, the cover crop, the hay, the erosion control, and the gentle regrowth of the seed that is seeded in. Usually the seeding in is done with a truac drill, a drill that is a range drill that plants seed that is oddball. Corn and soybeans, when they're planted, fall into a little cup and they fall down in your dropper very easily. But the prairie seed especially is maybe fluffy, maybe light. It has to be more or less pushed down droppers that are much wider. They're like 2 inches wide and tamped into the soil. So how do you get a prairie drill into this 100-foot scarred area where the pallets and culvert was? We'd like to know this so that we can see it. It might even be that we can subcontract to do the planting. And I was certainly there to see what's happening. There's also, when you put in silt fences to stop silt from moving sideways, the silt fence is put in with a ditch that's often 10 or 12 inches deep. And I'm watching those to see that they get covered up, because if people are working the prairie and they don't realize that there are these ditches, it's very easy to rick your ankle in a site that is not typical. So I'd like to see those sites filled with soil, and not necessarily pushed in like you're moving the prairie in, because the prairie isn't nicely established on either side. So I have questions there. There's also a culvert. The culvert went to the Cruise Farm before the university bought the Cruise Farm. It was on the east side of the railroad line. That culvert is tremendously useful to a lot of people. The railroaders sometimes appear there because sometimes they will have a square wheel problem that needs to be attended to, so they can detect that at that place. The electricians come in to service the power lines. The billboard people come in to change advertisings. And the prairie people do a work day and come in there too. So, and also the road people use that culvert as a site for storing a piece of equipment every once in a while. So that culvert has been taking heavy equipment, and it's somewhat caved in. So we have questions about that one too. So that's my wrap on Route 45. So leaving 45, I went along Windsor Road, which is also being developed, right across to Route 130 south, north to Walmart and Route 150. From 150 at Walmart to St. Joe is being developed. What is happening there is that the trail on the railroad, the old Conrail Railroad, runs next to the road, or rather the road runs next to the railroad, because the railroad was first and the road came later. We weren't able to get enough money to buy the line outright, so CSX bought CSX, a major railroad, bought the line and then sold 25 feet of it to the Department of Transportation for road widening. So we lost a huge amount of prairie there that we had really intended to buy the railroad for. The railroad is usually worked linearly, and it's 100 feet wide, and the area on either side is prairie. The talent now that the rail bed is owned by the Forest Preserve and the Vermilion County Conservation District, 25 miles, is locally owned. Now comes a period of trying to salvage some of the prairie. So 50 truckloads of prairie soil with prairie plants in it went to the Homer Lake, to the forest preserve there. And the rest of the prairie soil has been mounded up, ready to be rising the road 3 feet between Urbana and Mayview. That is underway, so if you're wondering why there's a huge mound of soil on the south side of 150 near John Deere, then that's waiting to lift the road by 3 feet. There's a lot of water accumulating there. Where the water goes is a good question, and Bill has been very helpful here in looking at what was the traditional pathway for that water to escape into the salt the Salt Creek. That's the natural drainage. But it's been very tempting to take out those drains and use the areas for corn and soybeans. And somehow that water has to get away. And either that or it stays there as an unintentional detention pond. The rail bed used to rise about 8 feet above the road level, so it was dry. But when you have a road coming into that railroad bed, your vehicle has to go up and over the rail and down on the other side. It was always rather dangerous and rather awkward. So that road has been taken out. So the question is whether, if you have a bicycle trail there, do you have a bicycle trail down and slowly up, or do you have a bridge over the road? So that's one of the questions I was looking at when I went to 150. While I was there, the next door fields were being harvested. So I took the opportunity to photograph the activities. The field was being harvested by Moore Family Farms, and they had a couple of combines that were running, huge pieces of equipment with large tires, mainly to help stop compaction of the soil. And they run constantly, and their body of grain that is accumulated is moved into wagons that run parallel, also with big tires, and they receive grain from the combine on the fly. That means that they're driving a tractor and a wagon along with the combine as it harvests. It is also filling up the wagon. When the wagon is filled, it goes to the edge of the field where the semi-trailer is. Most farmers own, or contractors own, semi-trailers that are used basically once a year, or at least the trailer is used once a year. The whole idea is that you don't allow semi-trailer with a heavy load to be waddling through your field and compacting the soil. There's also the possibility that if it's been raining fairly recently and you have small tires, you're going to get bogged. So the transport wagons unload into the semi-trailers at the edge of the road, and they are designed so that they have they often have stainless steel bodies, and they have trapdoors, a couple of trapdoors, so that the grain can be loaded without having to lift up the semi-trailer. So that grain goes to the nearest elevator, which is Fulls. So I waddled my way along to Fulls, past John Deere. John Deere is and Case and others are huge farm equipment providers, and that's very appropriate that they be there in that situation. I went to the elevator and got permission from the office, which is also in charge of the weighbridge, to take some photographs there. These will add to this program and let you understand a little bit about the unloading and storage of grain. Fulls was an interesting elevator. They made attempts to retain a grain line, which now will be a trail, into Urbana so that they could ship grain out by train, or still shipped out by train. Didn't happen because there was an interurban there, and that interurban was retired, but the corridor that provided the catenary for the interurban was retained by Illinois Power and later Ameren as a power line. So there were a couple of power line poles in the way, but it was going to cost an arm and a leg to change those. So Fulls decided to go on the road, and their grain goes to Sydney, where it then goes onto the rail. They can load 75 cars at once at Sydney. A usual train would be 100, 120 cars, but somehow the railroad didn't want to have a siding that was 100 cars long, so you can only load out 75 cars at once. You have to know that grain is going to Sydney like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 miles to the gallon, and so that's an expense. They have a very modern drying machine, and the trucks were coming in, and they were very different. Some were just wagons that came straight off the field and in, and some were like the semis that I'd been seeing previously, with a load, perhaps 75 bushels of corn or soybeans. Soybeans going into a different bin than corn. Some of the trucks that came in were tip trucks, so the grain was elevated out. In some cases, the elevator actually has a hydraulic hoist, and it lifts the front end of the vehicle up. So if you don't have a tip truck, you can still tip the grain out. They have a very new bin there, which is probably about 3 years old. You can't always fill it quickly because, like we were talking about, stones sort of disappearing into the ground. Elevators can do the same thing, and they can fall over if you. So when you first put them in, you have to see that the base concrete doesn't crack, that you load carefully over the first few years. And if those elevators are connected to each other, sometimes the elevator falling over can create a dust, and sometimes that dust can catch on fire. So sometimes if an elevator falls over, you're also associated with fire. But there's a weighbridge. You weigh in and you weigh out, and you get a ticket to say what you earned. There's a sampling of the grain, and to see that it's viable. There's often the discussion of how much yield is at the moment. Corn yield is somewhere in the vicinity of 250, 300 bushels an acre, which is very high, a good crop. And for soybeans, it's about 75 bushels an acre, which is also very high. That has some concerns because it might make the price of commodities like that cheaper. So there's also a question of how can you interpret this grain facility that very few people see. So I was talking to the manager, and there's an interest in how you could introduce bicycle people on the old Conrail railbed going right past the door. Or is that dangerous? Would that require a fence to protect the elevator from people? And another question is, do you need to burn the prairie? Yes, you do. And how does that relate to grain storage, especially at harvest time when there's a lot of dust? You have to know that the combines, as they're working in the field, create dust. It has an allergy problem, and so an elevator out in the middle of nowhere like Fulls is probably an advantage sometimes, because if you're in an urban situation, you can have dust falling on people's houses, and it's very hard to control. Combines actually have air-conditioned cabs, and that protects the driver. But so I went up the road, looked at the growth of prairie on the roadside development more towards the St. Joe end. Then by this time it's getting darker, so I'm reminded that Pioneer Grain is there, and Pioneer Grain doesn't accept grain as such. They usually harvest the cob in total. So the semi-trailer's bringing cobs to Pioneer Grain, which is sort of a genetic extension of hybrid corn. The trucks that bring those cobs unload with a little elevator that runs along the bottom of the semi-trailer and gently takes the cobs out without you having to tip them. So I took a photograph of that. And then I took a photograph of the active Fulls elevator, which is just about a mile to the west. And there was the yon horned moon in the distance. It's very hard to take a photograph of the horned moon and get a photograph of the elevator at the same time, but at least I was trying. So that was a few hours out. I want to say that today at 2 o'clock we'll be going to the Allerton area to look at resources there and the possibility of what we might do in the future there. We just lost some buildings there that we had hoped we could use, but we'll be looking at and perhaps doing some work there. But this is it's 12 o'clock. It's time we're out of here. This is Dave Monk, your Prarie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.